Joining me now, I'm very pleased to say, is Andrew Coombs, Chief Executive of Serious Real Estate. Andrew, thank you for joining me and sitting there so patiently through all of that. Some would say this is a very brave move, given the economic backdrop.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you very much indeed for having me on today. Look, we think it is. We're one of only 3 property companies on the London Stock Exchange in recent times to go to their shareholders and raise new equity. I'm delighted to tell you that we've been substantially oversubscribed on this capital raise, and we've managed to raise the money at single-digit discount to the net asset value of the company as a whole. So we're pleased.
That's a pretty good outcome, given the... You've obviously persuaded people of the case.
Well, you know, sometimes timing's on your side, which is good.
So what are the assets that you're interested in buying?
Well, we're interested in buying assets in both the UK and in Germany. We've very recently completed on 3 assets in London, in Islington and also in Camden, and 2 others, one in Liverpool and one in Barnsley. And we have 4 very specific assets in Cologne and in and around the Stuttgart area that we plan to use these proceeds to complete on in the future.
Why go for a new share issue rather than raise capital via a bank loan?
Well, look, debt is so uncertain at the moment, interest rates are high, and we're very, very fortunate in terms of the asset class that we're in. Industrial assets are very high yielding, and what that means is, if we take the assets in London as an example, we can go and buy them at nearly 8% initial yield and manage them to more than 11, which means that even when we raise equity at 10% discount to NAV, without lending, we can still make very good returns on these assets.
Right, that makes sense. Do you expect more opportunities like this to become available?
Yes, we think that we're at a point in the cycle now whereby sellers who've tried to hold on to assets because, you know, they don't accept that change in interest rates affects value of assets. What we're now beginning to see is some of those sellers face up to reality. And, you know, this is a classic point in the property cycle where things start to move.
Who are these people who are selling then? These are for sellers, private equity companies or insurance companies?
So if I go back to the stuff in London as an example, it's private equity companies that have done very well, but they can see that with the increased cost of lending going forward, they're not going to do quite as well, and therefore they're quite keen to exit at this point.
What about the broader economic backdrop? I mean, Germany entered a recession earlier on this year. Do you think it's still in recession?
Yes, I think it is, and I think it'll be in recession, you know, for several months to come. I think the UK is a little bit ahead of the cycle that Germany's in, and, you know, I think things are looking brighter at the moment in the UK than Germany. But I don't think Germany's very far behind, maybe 6-8 months.
I mean, looking at your results today, I mean, you were able to raise rent rolls by 9% in the UK, but just 7% in Germany. Is that just because of the softer backdrop in Germany?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that. Also, our presence in Germany is much bigger, 80% of our assets in Germany. So the numbers are bigger, therefore the percentage returns are slightly harder to get. But I think the reality is that the UK is probably a little bit more progressed in terms of where it's going, whereas I think Germany is still trying to, you know, survive 25 and get out the other side.
What about the autumn statement coming up the day after tomorrow? Anything that you'd like to see from the Chancellor?
Clarity for business. What business needs is they need clarity so they can make decisions, so they can understand the kind of returns they get, which is what will enable them to be able to attract investment. Clarity is what's needed.
And what sort of assumptions are you making about interest rates, both in the UK and in the Eurozone, over the next 12 months?
Well, fortunately, our UK business is debt-free, so we have no lending in the UK. In terms of Eurozone debt, we think that may now remain stable. However, we've got to be prepared for rises in the future. Fortunately, 95% of all our debt is fixed and locked down until at least the middle of 26.
And I think I read in the documents around the acquisition that your loan-to-value is actually going to fall as a result of all this.
We're very pleased about that. At the moment, or last week, we had a loan-to-value of 40.8%. As a result of today's capital raise, that will fall below 35%.
Well, very conservative. Andrew, appreciate you coming in today, and that's a really busy day for you.
Thank you very much, Ian.
Now, later this month sees the COP28 climate summit in Dubai amid evidence from the UN's latest stocktake, which suggests that current national climate action plans are currently not enough to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Well, joining me now is Catherine Dixon. She's partner at Bain & Company. Catherine, I know you've done your own analysis looking specifically at corporates. What have you found?
Yeah, well, the great news here is that, when you look at the forefront of the transition is accelerating. So we've seen exponential growth in technologies like wind and solar over the last few years, really defying expectations. But overall, I would say that businesses are really concerned about the pace of transition. So 30% of those that we surveyed thought they would still be using fossil fuels well into the 2050s. And that's despite many of them, having quite ambitious net zero targets. Governments have done a lot. But I think what we really need to see is those at the forefront of the transition getting much louder and more precise about what they need to transition.
What sort of businesses are we talking about here, Catherine, who are more dependent on fossil fuels? Is it things like steel and heavy industry?
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at some of the biggest energy consumers, consuming sectors. So we looked at power, road, shipping, aviation, cement, steel, and we asked these businesses, what their perspective was on the transition. So rather than looking backwards at, the emissions that are currently in those sectors, looking forwards at the rate of technology adoption. And yeah, it's those sectors that you commonly think of as being high fossil fuel users. So a lot of heavy industry, and in some cases, the power sector.
One thing that I was quite struck by in your research is that more than 70% of businesses told you that government regulation is the key driver for accelerating the energy transition. You'd think in the private sector that would be, shareholders and customers.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the pressure on businesses is intensifying from shareholders and customers. That's true. But, when they look at their climate targets, they can't invest in a way that is not commercially viable. They can't invest in the absence of commercial realities. So, we need businesses to innovate and to take risks. But what they really need from governments is the policy environment that means that they can get that stable environment that allows them to get a return on investment.
What do you think government should do to try and drive private sector activity further?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think over the last few years, we've seen through the Paris Agreement, has been catalytic for climate. We've seen more and more national governments putting in place targets, putting in place policies. But I think it's really time to take stock. This system of national target setting is not really well designed for many of the global economic sectors you might think about, the heavy energy users. The energy transitions are really a series of technology transitions. So if we want governments to help business, they need to do less climate diplomacy and more coordinated industrial policy.
And what do you mean by that? Of the kind that Joe Biden's done in the United States?
Well, we need it to be coordinated. If you think like a sector about like steel, for example, which you raised earlier, 9% of global emissions. But of course, it's a strategically important sector for many countries. When you think about who the big players are in steel, it's China, it's India. Clearly it's important to European competitiveness, US competitiveness. So if you want to decarbonize that sector, which will take investment, which will cost more than maybe high carbon technology right now, then you probably have to think about how you coordinate policy across the major markets to create a level playing field.
I mean, that's the trouble, isn't it? The Biden administration is looking at this as very much a way of boosting the US economy. The EU's had to try and respond in kind. Britain's caught in the middle like a cork bobbing on the high seas, really. I mean, there isn't much coordination going on there. It seems like sort of competition in industrial policy.
Well, we're not really set up that way. Our system for managing climate is basically national. If you think about the 20th century, we managed to develop all sorts of multilateral processes, and we've forgotten that art, how to work together and create common rules. And I think although subsidy is really, really important for bringing down the cost of technologies, if we want to see, adoption, across the global economy, we're going to need to get much better at coordinating that policy.
How do you think the current interest rate environment has been stymieing progress? Obviously, for a lot of businesses, their cost of capital has risen pretty substantially over the last 18 months.
Yeah, well, I think it's created a lot of challenges for some industries, and we've got to get out of the habit of thinking that we've got this, such a low cost of capital. And I think this is exactly the moment where business needs government really to step in, because for a lot of the projects that we need to get invested in, these are 20, 30-year timelines, and businesses really need to understand that policy environment so that they can have that really understand the revenue and how that's going to work over the 30 year timeline. And clearly interest rates have really complicated that, and it's happened very quickly.
OK, Catherine, we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Good to see you this afternoon. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.
Well, that's it from me today. I'm sorry we didn't get the full half hour of business news in there, but hopefully there was something in there to tickle your fancy. I can tell you the London market has finished down very slightly. The FTSE 100 very slightly lower right now. Mark Austin's up next with the News Hour. I'll hopefully be back at 11:30 tomorrow. See you then. Cheerio.